Greetings. Today is the 12th of December on the Gregorian calendar, which marks the feast of La Virgen de Guadalupe in the Latin rite of the Catholic Church. And this happens to be my favorite feast. I love this time of year, not only because of Christmas, but also because at this time the churches are often packed, especially on this day. And at this time of year, the churches smell wonderful as the Guadalupanos, the devotees of La Virgen de Guadalupe, flood the churches with flowers. So I wanted to throw together a very quick video sharing some brief thoughts on this day, on this feast, some interesting bits of trivia, and even some clips from some films on the subject, which I personally love and would recommend to others. So to begin this video on a fun note, as some like to show pictures of popes standing before Black Madonna depictions, I'd like to show this image of Pope Francis standing before an apparent Black Madonna. However, he's not in Poland and he's not in Brazil. Rather, he's visiting the Cathedral Basilica of St. Peter's and Paul in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this was in 2015. Now, like I said, at first glance, he seems to be standing before an image of the Black Madonna. Yet he's standing before an image of La Virgen de Guadalupe, who is not typically depicted with that particular skin tone. Now, one might want to try to argue that this particular statue is made out of bronze, so the skin color is only that way because of the material which was used to make the depiction. But I'd propose that the reality, the fact of the matter, is a bit more complex than such a simple explanation might let on. So here's an interesting added detail. In 2011, Pope Benedict XVI gave a homily on La Virgen de Guadalupe at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and he gave this homily on her feast day. Now, as he was in Rome, he spoke in Italian, and at one point, he referenced La Virgen de Guadalupe by the Spanish title, La Morenita de Tepeyac. However, when one turns to the Vatican's official English translation of that homily, one finds that that phrase is translated the Black Madonna of Tepeyac. Now, again, some might wonder what's going on here. Some might want to say that morena, or its diminutive form, morenita, can mean black, but others might want to say no, not necessarily. Maybe it means something more like brown. And others might note that as La Virgen de Guadalupe is typically not depicted in a way which many present-day Americans would consider quote-unquote black, perhaps black in that text is not meant the way that some might think. Well, I shared these interesting and perhaps confusing bits of trivia to set up a historical detail about the Mexican icon known as La Virgen de Guadalupe, which I've mentioned in previous videos. And before I explicitly restate what I have in mind, permit me to share something that Pope John Paul II said while visiting the shrine of the Black Madonna in Extremadura in Spain in 1982. During that visit, he made a passing reference which connected the shrine, that shrine in Spain, to one which is associated with the shrine of La Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico. So here, listen to this.
La promesa mesiánica hecha a Abraham se difundía en el Nuevo Mundo y en Filipinas. No es significativo que hoy nos encontremos en el santuario mariano de Guadalupe de la tierra española. Y que contemporáneamente el santuario homónimo de México se haya convertido en lugar de peregrinación para toda Hispanoamérica. También yo he tenido la dicha de ir como peregrino al Guadalupe mexicano al principio de mi servicio en la sede de Pedro.
Now, again, the Pope was at a shrine in Spain dedicated to a Black Madonna known as La Virgen de Guadalupe, but he was making reference to a shrine in Mexico dedicated to the famous Mexican icon by the same name. In other words, what he was alluding to was the fact that the famous Mexican icon of La Virgen de Guadalupe is actually named after the Black Madonna of Guadalupe in Extremadura, Spain. And there's a lot of interesting history in that shrine in Spain. For example, as I've touched on in a previous video, when Columbus asked the Spanish monarchy to finance his trip west, they actually met at the King and Queen's private suite, which was set up beside that shrine. And they met there to discuss this matter of financing his voyage. And Columbus may have received his financing practically in the shadow of the Black Madonna of Guadalupe. And by the way, it's also said that Hernan Cortez, that his parents likewise brought him to the same shrine when he was a sickly baby to pray for his health. Now, I realize that this can confuse some Americans who wish to lock artistic depictions of biblical figures into like a single morphology, into one sort of appearance, one skin tone or whatever, right? But I would propose, however, that as the church has permitted a range of morphologies in depictions of the Virgin Mary and other biblical figures, it's a clear signal that there is no morphological requirement to such symbolic depictions of biblical figures in ecclesiastical art. Beyond that, on a deeper level, I would also be open to the idea that, however, I should say that this is an idea which I realize many might not be ready for, but nonetheless, I personally would be open to the idea that as forms of the Virgin Mary appear to different people at different times, in different locations, those appearances, the appearances of those forms, these visions can likewise differ from one another. But perhaps that's a discussion for another day, and that's something more for the context of Catholic belief in like appearances of biblical figures like the Virgin Mary.
One thing.
But switching gears abruptly, I now want to turn to films which discuss or depict the story of the appearance of La Virgen de Guadalupe in 16th century Mexico. My favorite movie on this subject is the one you see on your screen, which is from Santiago Parra's 2006 film titled Guadalupe, el Milagro y el Mensaje. And I got to see this film in a theater in New York City in 2006, and Mexico's ambassador was there at the screening. And the ambassador said something interesting while introducing the film. He said that the story of La Virgen de Guadalupe is the story of a first-century Jewish peasant girl reconciling two contradictory cultures, that of the pagan Aztec culture and the Spanish Christian culture. And I thought that was beautifully put, and I also found it thought-provoking. And as for the film itself, I found it to be beautifully shot, and I also appreciated that a lot of the dialogue is in the indigenous Mexican language, Nahuatl. There are scenes depicting Saint Juan Diego encountering the vision of the Virgin Mary on Tepeyac Hill, and their dialogue is not in English and it's not in Spanish. Rather, all the dialogue between Saint Juan Diego and the Virgin Mary are in Nahuatl.
Juan Diego Tzin. Tlashikaki na Shokoyo Juan Tzin. Kampa intimohuica.
Siguapile. No chpotzine. No te cuyo Kampa no nasis huichancinco mexicotlatilolco. No contepotztoca in teoyotl.
Mashikmati no Shokoyo. Canehuatl ininantzin. Inguelneli teotl. Huelnigneki. Nican esquechilisque no tocaltzin. Y nunca ni neshtis no te tlasotlalis. Y notech motemachilia.
The film is actually like two films, switching back and forth between the 16th century and the 21st century. And I found the more modern scenes less interesting, but I really enjoyed the scenes which take place in the 1500s, especially the climax of the film, where after St. Juan Diego has the flowers in his tilma, blessed by the Virgin Mary, he presents such to the Spanish bishop in Mexico City who had been asking him for a sign for the claims that he had making. And at that point, as he opens his tilma, he reveals the famous icon. And I'm going to play that scene. And the scene is in both in Nahuatl and Spanish.
Señor, Juan Diego está aquí y dice traerla para acá.
Tehuatzin obispo. Onichiki mutal Nahuatl.
Señor obispo, hice lo que me ordenaste.
Ni canca Inesca, il huicactonansin.
Aquí está la señal que envía la Señora del Cielo.
Giseli. Y camo yolotzin.
Dígnate a recibirla.
Juan Diego, perdóname por no haberte creído. Perdona, Dios mío, por haber dudado. Gracias, Señor.
Another interesting film is from 2010 titled 1531 or 1531, with the subtitle being La Historia que aún no termina. It was directed by Antonio Peláez, and it was shot in the style of a documentary, though with actors reenacting both Spanish and native figures from the 16th century.
Perdóname por no haberte creído.
Now, some might wonder why I'm so into this subject. And I would say that first and foremost, being a Catholic in New York City, it's hard to miss the presence of La Virgen de Guadalupe within the Catholic tapestry. But beyond that, I would also note that she's the patroness of the Philippines. And for those who don't know, the Catholic Church in the Philippines used to be under the Bishop of Mexico. Beyond that, as Deirdre de la Cruz noted on page 56 of her book, Mother Figure, Marian Apparitions and the Making of Filipino Universal, the earliest Filipino text to make reference to the apparition of La Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico described the indigenous people of Mexico as Tagalog. Juan Diego, Saint Juan Diego, who encountered the vision of the Virgin Mary on Tepeyac Hill, is described as Tagalog, and references made to those from Mexico and those from the Philippines. And I believe that she says the Tagalog text reads, Samanga taga Mexico at gayon din naman sa tagarito sa Filipinas. And there's also a text which refers to Tagalogs here, manga Tagalog dito, and Tagalogs there, manga Tagalog dun. And I don't know. Me personally, I find that fascinating that the story is presented in such a way that, that sort of blurs the line between the Tagalog people of the Philippines and the native people of Mexico. And there's some linguistic overlap, and but again, that too is a topic for another time. Whatever the case, aside from becoming a patroness of the Philippines, you can find La Virgen de Guadalupe throughout the Catholic world now. Here's a Facebook post about Catholics in Palestine, and there is an icon of La Virgen de Guadalupe in the relevant church, which the photograph was taken in. And as I noted earlier, I once heard the ambassador of Mexico refer to the Virgin Mary as a first-century peasant girl, first-century Jewish peasant girl. And I love the idea of that first-century Jewish peasant girl spreading across 16th century Mexico, then later on moving on to become the Empress of the Americas, spreading across the Catholic parishes in North and South America, and then going on to inspire Catholics all over the world. Having said that, I know this video has been all over the place. I just want to share some interesting points, but I'd like to close with a beautiful scene from David Naglieri's 2015 documentary, Guadalupe, the Miracle and the Message, which is available on Amazon. And in this clip, a Catholic priest discusses what the Virgin Mary, and more importantly, her son, Christ, who's at the center of all this, despite the fact that some might not feel that way. Some might feel there's too much emphasis on the Virgin Mary and not enough on Christ. So this Catholic priest is going to bring Christ back to the center of it. And, when discussing what the appearance of the Virgin Mary meant to a culture which was transitioning from the horrors of human sacrifices to the Christian faith. And so with that, enjoy the clip, and God bless.
12 de diciembre, exactamente el día del solsticio de invierno, exactamente cuando los indígenas celebraban incluso la gran fiesta de Panquetzaliztli. Los misioneros decían, es como la Pascua indígena. Ahora entiendo perfectamente el momento que escogió Dios a través de la Virgen de Guadalupe para encontrarse con el ser humano. Hagas de cuenta que la Virgen de Guadalupe le dice a los indígenas, yo los entiendo. Yo entiendo los sacrificios humanos, porque yo estuve delante de la cruz de mi hijo. Yo sé lo que es un sacrificio humano porque yo lo viví, yo lo sufrí. Yo estuve delante de mi hijo viendo cómo derramaba su sangre y ofrecía su cuerpo para la salvación de todos. Ya no más sacrificios. Mi hijo es el único y eterno sacrificio.